Welcome back to the Top Shelf Literary Editions. This is episode 98. Thank you for joining me. We're taking a look currently at my top 10 favorite books of all time as I cap off this series. There's only 2 episodes to go after this, and they're going to be a little bit more long form because I have a lot more to say about them. My name is Ernest Whiteman III. I'm a Northern Ramapo filmmaker, artist, writer, and media educator, and we're taking a look at the top shelf of my book collection today. Take a look at my top 10 films, favorite books of all time. We'll talk about what's coming up next at the end of this episode, and what I'm doing next. But right now, coming in at number 3 of my top 10 favorite books of all time is Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. You saw that I did A Pleasure to Burn, but everybody, I think, who's taken high school English knows the story of Fahrenheit 451, set in sort of a quasi-dystopian future where books are banned. The act of reading is not, but books are banned, and so is a lot of media. And this is about government control of emotions, and they deem books hazardous to one's mental health. So it is the story of Guy Montag, who is 30 years old, and that's pointed out regularly in the book. And he's a fireman, and his job is to go out and start fires. When they hear reports of a book being planted or have been, or in an area, they go to the area, search for the books, and they burn the books. And if the area is too big, they will burn the whole house down, because in this future time, houses are fireproof. And Guy Montag never questions his job until he meets Clarice. I think it's Clarice. Clarissa? You know what? I really need to read this again. Clarice, who asks him if he's ever read the books he burns. And that makes him start to question everything. And eventually he does, and he starts to read the books, he starts to become overcome with emotions, he starts to act out. He tries to make his wife, who's enamored of the TVs on their walls and all of the content that's coming through there. Everything's about being faster, quicker. Your entertainment needs to be quick. Your cars need to be quick. Your transportation needs to be quick. And all hanging overhead of this, there are war jets screaming overhead, and that's, I think, a point that nobody in all the adaptations have really talked about. The threat of impending war that sort of pervades the book. And when he's discovered that he's been taking and hiding and reading books, he has this confrontation with Captain Beatty. And earlier they talk about, allowing firemen to take home one book to read, so they know that they're doing the right thing by burning them. And he meets Professor Faber, who was a college professor at some point before, things became what they've become. And one of the most sad things about Guy Montag is that he can never remember where he met his wife. It's just that he's always had this life with her that he remembers, and that's because of how media has programmed them, is to only think in the short term. They don't really have short-term memories. So they can overcome things really easily, like bad news. The next day they're fine. I believe there's also some drugs involved. But it all comes to not only questioning an authoritative government, which this kind of does, it also questions our susceptibility to the ease of comfort, or this overwhelming need to be entertained rather than informed, which still has some connections to our society today. And I first encountered this book in high school. We were asked to read this. In fact, I think this is the actual book that I kept from my English class at St. Stephen's. So my apologies to them for taking this. I just couldn't be without the story, and I really thought the cover was pretty cool. In fact, this has another reason why I really enjoyed this book is that it's had a really deep connection to why I became a filmmaker. We were watching the Trofu version in English class because we were looking at adaptations of the book. And it was made in the 60s, and by those standards, sci-fi really wasn't up to snuff. And one of my classmates said, hey man, this was the era of the late 80s, so it was Back to the Future, Indiana Jones, ILM, the dominance of ILM in movie making. He said, man, with what we can do today in movies, we can make a really kick-ass version of this movie, of Fahrenheit 451. And that really got me thinking. He says, yeah, why hasn't anybody done a really kick-ass version of Fahrenheit 451? Because there was all these flying cars that I imagined as the spinners in Blade Runner. And then my next thought was, why couldn't I do a kick-ass version of 451? And I have since tried to adapt this into a stage play. And I've gotten pretty far in it, but I haven't done anything with it yet. And as you can see, the pages are so yellow from its age. But this has just become one of my favorite books. It keeps me thinking about how much media influences us. Entertainment versus information. Learning rather than, observing. And so those are the key questions that I find in here. And that's why it's made my top 10 favorite books of all time. So Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 is on the top shelf for today. It sits at number 3. Coming up next in episode 99 is a long form video titled The Face of the Mountain. Talks about Joseph and Marshall III's The Journey of Crazy Horse. Crazy Horse is a hero of mine, and I'll be going a lot more in depth about Native representations versus authority versus experience. So it's going to be a longer form video. I hope you stick around for that. Then the episode after that, episode 100, Reading Alone for 1,000 Miles, is on The Three Kingdoms, which is my #1 favorite book of all time, and I hope you stick around for those. Coming up after the top shelf literary editions, once this series ends, I will be starting a new series that I hope you stick around for. It's called 10 and 10 documentary series. It's 10-minute long short documentaries on various topics that I find interesting. The first episode, episode 1, will be on Paul Edward Miller, who is a jazz critic in the 40s and 50s. He was one of the top critics at Downbeat magazine, wrote a couple of jazz yearbooks, is also the father of my partner. And I find his story plenty interesting because in that time, which was of great segregation, he was one of the few jazz critics that felt that African American music was the origin of jazz music, and he really felt that black jazz was superior to other forms of jazz, felt that they had originated the form of jazz, hosted his own radio show for a while, and was a very prolific writer in Esquire magazine about his jazz picks. So those are the things that I'm working on in the future. I'm working on several short films as well, and I hope you stick around for that. And I'm, as always, ever working on my production of Hamlet. So I want to thank you. I'll see you in the next episode, and thank you for joining me, and I'll catch you next time.